Hey everybody, it's Jason McCann with Mountain Tactical Company. For the last 15 years, we have made a business out of replacing the plastic components on your Tikka rifle with precision quality metal components. But we've never really done a video on the pros and cons of metal versus plastic. So let's dive in to the pros and cons of metal versus plastic components in your rifle system. So firearms used to be made out of just beautiful pieces of wood, elaborate metal work. There was a lot of pride that went into someone's firearm and the manufacturing process for firearms. And now we're left with, you go to the gun store and everything has plastic stocks and plastic components. And what's the cons of going to plastic? And the number one con is it's not as durable as metal. Yes, as we've shown in our anatomy videos, you could have glass fiber or carbon fiber reinforced polymers, and there's, wild, expensive polymer mixtures that are used by NASA and the space shuttle. Well, I guess we don't have the space shuttle anymore, do we? But anyways, in aerospace, there are elaborate plastics, but those aren't the ones that are being used in the firearms industry. And so what we have is kind of low durability, squishy plastics. They don't handle heat well, and so they're always in some part of the rifle far away from the barrel or some place where you can get away with using a cheaper material. The other issue with plastics, and not to go greeny, but this is reality, is the plastics used in firearms do not recycle well, and they don't decompose. So where these guns, you could dig them up 1,000 years from now and they're probably still going to look like you're still going to have this plastic stock, you're still going to have this plastic bottom metal and magazines, and I don't know, maybe future archaeologists will have interesting things to say about that. But the thing is from a consumer standpoint, this is kind of viewed as cheap. One of the biggest complaints we hear about the Tikka rifle system is the cheap plastic stock. Even though this is a well-engineered stock, the perceived value is not there. So everyone wants high-quality metal components, but there's no free lunch. So the cons of metal is it's heavier. Steel is cheap, but it's really heavy. And so we can get around that by using, a high-quality aerospace grade of aluminum like 6061 or 7075. However, that is significantly more expensive than just your run-of-the-mill steels that you would see on a pre-64 Winchester would use a mild steel trigger guard. That's going to weigh significantly more than a lightweight aluminum trigger guard. And then you have to have coatings on it. Metals corrode. You have rust, and even aluminum, it does corrode. That's where you see old aluminum fixtures or buildings, and you get this white chalky surface on the aluminum. That's actually corrosion on the aluminum. So aluminum has to have some sort of anodic layer on it or a Cerakote, something to protect the base metal. Even titanium, there's an old saying that no one's ever actually seen titanium because it instantly creates an oxide layer on the surface. And so technically, no one's ever seen raw titanium. The titanium that we look at that's raw is actually a layer of corrosion on top of it. So you got to coat metal. You can't just have raw metals out there. Some metals do better raw, but eventually they're all going to corrode, even stainless steels. Metals are more expensive than plastic. Plastic is dirt cheap. It's once you pay for an injection mold, squirting plastic into that thing is pennies, and that's why everybody's doing it. And so it's significantly more expensive, and the manufacturing process for metal is significantly more expensive as well. You have to have a significant amount of machinery. You have to have actual skilled operators, skilled programmers. It's not like an injection molding machine where it just two plates come together and you have someone load and unload the machine. There's a lot of skill in making the mold, but once the mold's made, it's a pretty straightforward process. The other con on metal is there's less room for error, and that's because on plastic components, you can have really loose tolerances And because there's draft angles, there's no straight wall on any plastic part. You have less tolerance for error. And so with that less tolerance for error, you need to make sure everything is assembled correctly and in tolerance. Otherwise, your rifle system is not going to work properly. All right, well, with all the cons on plastic, why would anybody use it? And the reason why is because it's cheaper to manufacture a plastic part than a metal part for a multitude of reasons. You can have a looser tolerance part made out of plastic, because plastic just kind of bends and meshes into things. So if you watched our series on stock inlet imperfections, it's not as much of an issue with a plastic trigger guard versus a metal one, because this is going to bend and twist into shape in that imperfection on the stock, where metal cannot do that. And so the other reason why you can go with looser tolerances on plastic is because you don't have any straight walls. Everything's at an angle. They're called draft angles in the mold, because this has to pop out of the mold. If you had straight walls on a plastic part, it would actually shear and tear apart when it's being ejected out of the mold. So from a design perspective, you can have this wide tolerance stack, and the plastic parts are, because everything's angular, are just going to kind of fit together and mesh together. And so you have a component that's less expensive to make, you have a less expensive manufacturing process, you have pennies worth of plastic in this particular trigger guard, and this trigger guard probably by once you make the mold, probably takes all of about 1 minute to make, where it takes 45 minutes to make a precision metal component. The other thing that you have with plastic is you have a lot more design freedom. You can have these organic shapes, these curvatures, because it takes longer to manufacture this curvature in metal than it does in plastic. The mold takes care of it. So on our metal trigger guards, the longest operation is this organic curvature that we put on our trigger guards, because we want that organic old school look. And that is the longest process of this entire machining cycle. The other thing is, because this is popping out of a mold, it's very consistent. You know, the molds do wear down over time, but the plastics, unless you're dealing with, you know, the glass-filled fibers, something that's more caustic or abrasive, that's the more accurate term, abrasive, is the mold's not going to wear out until you've run tens of thousands of parts, sometimes 100,000 parts through it if you have a quality mold. So it's not as much of an issue. You're going to have more consistency. Plastic is lighter. It doesn't rust. And like I said earlier, you can kind of make it look like whatever you want, as long as you can have mold pieces come together and release, and you don't have any undercuts or traps for the plastic to mechanically lock into that mold. It's going to pop out, go on a conveyor, and get installed into your rifle. So lots of pros to the plastic game, and the biggest one is the cost savings. And that's why so many manufacturers are switching over to plastic parts. So with all those pros on plastic, why would anybody want to use metal? Metal is just better. It's more durable. It resists impact better. You can make everything to a tighter tolerance, and it's thermally resistant. You know, where you heat up plastic, sit this on your dashboard in your car on a hot day in Texas and come back and see what you get, versus a high quality metal component, which is just going to be exactly the same as it was when you put it on the dashboard. So plastic is not thermally resistant, where metal will just retain its shape. The tighter tolerances mean that you're going to have a more accurate system. It does require somebody with more skill to put metal components together than plastic components, because you have a much narrower tolerance window. But when you put those metal components together, you're going to have a more rigid, a more accurate, and an overall better performing rifle system. And then on top of all that, the perception of quality is higher with metal. And honestly, I don't know if that's just because, growing up, I mean, at least in my generation, we didn't want anything plastic. Younger shooters out there might be like, well, everything's plastic, and then you're just used to it. But we grew up with these beautiful metal and wood firearms, and we just like metal. I mean, there's a higher perceived value, and therefore, if you have a firearm where you replace the plastic components with metal components, that firearm is going to have a higher perceived value than one with plastic. So I provided a broad pro-con list for metal versus plastic components on your rifle system. And what we want to do is we want to provide you with the information that's out there, so you can make an educated decision that meets your goals so you can enjoy your trigger time.